Good morning, I hope you're all well. Today I'll be talking about griffins and where they can be found. The goal of this talk is to explore how utilising GIS, or ArcMaps in particular, can help challenge influential narratives and allow us to examine and reinterpret legacy data in new ways. Firstly, I'll introduce my current research topic as a case study, the why of it and narratives around it. Then I'll briefly discuss the processes involved in managing legacy data. And finally, I'll show some preliminary results and potential next steps. The impetus of this project came from a desire to explore things that many scholars just know. It struck me that whenever I've read about mythical creatures, that griffins in particular always meant royalty, divinity, power. And I can understand the logic, the melding of two creatures, a lion and an eagle, both animals historically associated with empires, considered apex predators. But in the late Bronze Age Aegean, an extra set of criteria was added. Griffins are associated with women. Now this struck me, as yes, there are a number of famous seals that depict the Potnia Theron, or mistress of animals, flanked by griffins, such as this example here. But there are also many that depict her with birds or lions. Why should it that these particular depictions become a primary reason for the meaning? And it then became clear when looking at comparative seal stones in the Eastern Mediterranean, griffins there were predominantly displayed with male protagonists. So I started questioning whether or not this was a sample bias, a result of clearly different cultural practices, or assumptions on the part of archaeologists. So I followed this up and discovered that griffin representations exhibit considerable contextual, spatial, and temporal variation. However, determination of their meaning remains planted in the realm of iconographic and stylistic interpretation. In Aegean archaeology, there remains substantial reliance on objects that not only lack secure provenance, but which are frequently constructs of 19th and 20th century reconstructive narratives. As you can see on this example, this was possibly found in a Dictaean cave. It doesn't have secure provenance. The data I'll be referencing today was sourced through the Digital CMS Catalogue, a large-scale and ongoing digital project aimed at digitizing Aegean seals and seal stones. To give you a brief history of interpretation, since the exceptional and extravagant excavations of the 19th and 20th century, the mystery and glamour of Knossos, Pylos and Mycenae sparked widespread interest in the Aegean Bronze Age. And the excavation, publication and, collection of these antiquities was driven by imperialism, and the footprint of this early foreign inquiry is evident throughout the field. One of the contentions to be discussed in more depth in a paper by myself and Maddie Harris at Amphore later in September is the continued usage of interpretations based on these late 19th and early 20th century discourses. This reliance, we argue, is partially due to the difficulty in accessing adequate data from previously excavated and published sites to consider reinterpretation, particularly in the current climate. So historically and currently, these sites and the tales of these glorious sites privilege time over space. They focus on the age of products, how it was different, special, more unique than other objects, and studies continuously tend to privilege these objects that illustrate these same goals. And it's becoming more apparent, however, that spatial analysis of these objects today can actually challenge some of these assumptions and illustrate different types of storytelling. Now, as a number of you are aware, there are several issues utilizing legacy data. One of the primary challenges in archaeology is consistency. Even during excavations today, there are sometimes aspects that are taken for granted, decisions not recorded, or background information that isn't discussed. In the case of legacy data, particularly data from the 19th century, these issues increase tenfold. It should be acknowledged that data collection and subsequent interpretation is fundamentally tied to the user's intended purpose. So in the case of these very early excavations, those purposes do not reflect the same as excavations today. Many focused on object collection, fund acquisitions, and the validation of imperial concerns. So this intent should always be at the forefront of our mind when using legacy data. So for analysis, as much as possible, this data needs to be clean, it needs to be consistent, and any uncertainties recorded. Here's a good model of some of the errors that may occur or need to be acknowledged and ideally addressed when using analysis. So this is from Gupta 2020, just this year, and kind of looks at a bunch of different types of error. So specifically here in the center there, in the sources of error, that straight up data collection, processing, logical consistency. So the issue I'm facing, and I'm sure many others faces, is that legacy data hides serious logical and empirical faults in underlying assumptions. So thus we need to develop confidence levels to reflect this and explore different ways of using the data. So the case study today comprises objects from the Late Bronze Age, East Mediterranean, that depict griffins. So I'm only going to discuss seal stones and sealings that depict griffins today, although my wider research looks at many different types of media. As I mentioned, I sourced this data from the digital CMS catalogue, and their goal is consistency. Yet this is difficult when excavators record different details, nor can they address issues when an excavation report doesn't include precise locations of the seal or interpretation of materials. So for materials, if the database describes the material as jasper, is it different from others recorded as red jasper? What about rock crystal versus quartz? Soft stone versus hard stone? When I made this graph for all of the materials recorded, it made me question all of these issues. So a broader question to ask, and some of you may have the answer, is that how can the original database be updated with more useful designations, and more importantly, without being able to see the object myself, subjecting it to a hand lens and a tame geologist? How can the data be cleaned and streamlined for my research without erasing the original excavator's analysis? Further problems with this data is its inconsistency. So some reports note a seal comes from a site, others will describe the grave, some might describe the location, yet actually note that there are similar objects that can fit this description. So excavators themselves at any point in time function as encoders. They may have a more comprehensive existing knowledge about the spatial relationships, yet this knowledge is not always recorded. And so for legacy data, these relationships are now invisible. So today, the same archaeologist would ideally excavate, analyze, interpret, transfer that data. However, these practices are relatively new. And I am sure we all aim to record our own logic when cleaning data and publishing. Now here's an example of some of the decisions I made when polishing data for this talk. So I started off with the basic question, does it have provenience? Yes, include it. No, don't include it. Is it certain? Does it have a question mark? If it does, I included it straight away. If it doesn't, ideally in the future, I'll go back, see if I can find more details about it. Does it have those clear material descriptions? Yes, that's great, we'll use it. No, don't include it. Does it have a companion? This is what I'm going to come up to later in the talk. Yes. Can we designate it male, female? Was it an animal? Can we actually tell what gender it is? Or does it have humans and animals together? So those are some of the questions that I had to think about. So to reiterate, the purpose of this research is to explore the established knowledge of these objects, how they were used, and the role of imagery on these objects. And can spatial analysis provide insight into how these objects and images were used? So after a lot of data cleaning, I came up with only 112 examples for this talk. And I started with a couple of questions, some of which can be answered using basic statistics. Were griffins primarily depicted with women? As you can see, overwhelmingly, no. For the most part, they are displayed alone. Now, a reminder, I'm ignoring objects with no provenience. Objects without provenience can support iconographic research, but they might hinder or hide contextual analysis. So rather, it's actually much more common for griffins to appear alone. And as you can see the next stage down with other animals, generally lions or deer. And then we've got 9 that are depicted with males, 5 with females. And then you can see I've actually got a couple of different categories for, are they depicted with males and animals, or generic humans and animals? Do they have both male and female, or just kind of a generic human figure? So quite often they're actually depicted very much like this one, the carnelian seal stone from the tomb of the Griffin warrior, So this is a very typical depiction of a griffin, usually by themselves, seated, looking over their wings. So then I kind of questioned that this very typical seal stone here was found in a male grave. And then I wanted to ask can we use a map to see if there are any correlations in seal type based on their companions or lack thereof? So this is where we get this map, this initial map I've done. It is a little bit pastel-y, sorry. But as you can see with the pink circles, which are the griffins depicted alone, they're found spread out. They're quite common relatively everywhere. But actually, if you see the purple ones, with griffins and animals, are much more common in Crete, and there are a couple in Santorini and Thera. But then there are a couple of interesting patterns that are starting to come out, and a bigger sample size might help here. But actually, griffins depicted with males tend to predominantly be more on the mainland. There are a couple on Crete, but a few more on the mainland. And ones which show males and animals seem to be hanging out in Attica. And again, this is something that a larger sample size will obviously help analyze a little bit better. So then we kind of questioned well, what context are all of these griffins found in? And further down the track, I'd like to look at whether or not these contexts have anything to do with the compositions. So this is where we have griffin objects predominantly are found in mortuary contexts. So they are excavated in multiple mortuary administrative, and a significant consideration regarding these contexts lies in identifying the intentionality of that final deposition. So objects found in mortuary contexts served a role specific to the burial practice, the individual or all three. And it's also clear that the mortuary find context has contributed significantly to the survival of many griffin seal stones, thus introducing another sample bias into the data. So as you can see, there's still work to be done here in clarifying differences between, say, cult sites and caves and grottos. What are houses versus administration, which actually, if amalgamated, could surpass the mortuary context? And what does unspecified mean? So these are areas where I need to go back to the excavation reports to really tidy this up. But further questions is kind of more broader. So what is the concentration of griffins across the Aegean? Are they more common in one area over another? So this is where I've done a basic map just looking at the concentration of griffins in their different contexts. So as you can see, there are larger concentrations in Knossos, Katazacro and East Crete, Pylos and Mycenae, all relatively large centres, so that makes sense. But I haven't actually distinguished actual seals here from sealings. So particularly in Katazacro and Knossos, some of these griffin depictions are copies. So there are multiple clay sealings of the same composition. And what does that mean? Does that actually affect how we interpret the use of these objects? Now, as you can see, Katazacro has a large kind of house usage, which comes to that question of what is a house versus an administrative use. And in Knossos, it's largely administrative with some house finds. Again, you've got that question. But predominantly in Mycenae, you've actually got a lot of mortuary finds. In Pylos, you've got administrative and mortuary. So there's a really interesting kind of dynamic here that I need to clarify some of these terms. But actually also you can already see a little bit of a different usage kind of across the Aegean here, particularly in northern Greece. You've definitely got very different usages than you do in Crete, say. So some other questions I want to ask in this research is, does the material influence the context? Does the material influence where they're found? Does the fine context influence the composition or vice versa? Some of you may have noticed that quite a few of these objects were made of agate or carnelian. Does that colour actually mean anything? So another kind of aspect that this research is looking at is how can these maps, or how can the use of these using legacy data change the narratives that we're talking about. So in its simplest form, utilizing basic statistics in GIS allows us to explore potential correlations between these context materials composition. And as you can see just so far from these preliminary results, shown here with a relatively low level of confidence in some areas, it actually enables us to explore the possibilities of these legacy data, ask new questions of it, and reanalysis such as this allows us to investigate these influential narratives within the archaeological field and critically approach them.